I was at a high-end charity gala last month, standing near the bar with a man whose net worth has 10 digits. We weren't talking about the stock market or luxury watches. Instead, he was watching this younger entrepreneur cross the room. This guy was frantically pitching a new idea to a group of investors. He was sweating, his eyes darting, just pouring every ounce of his soul into winning that conversation. My companion, he took this slow sip of his drink. His expression was entirely neutral, and he whispered something that really stuck with me. He said, he thinks he's playing to win, but he doesn't realize he's just playing the role we wrote for him.
Wow.
Yeah. So I asked him what he meant. I was expecting some lecture on venture capital, but instead he described the scene like a game of chess, where the younger man was a knight, moving exactly as a knight should, but was just completely unaware of the hand moving the board.
That's a chilling metaphor.
It was. To my companion, the hustle and the grind that most people admire, well, they weren't signs of ambition. He saw them as symptoms of being trapped in a predefined box. But what was really striking was the sudden shift in his tone when I mentioned the word freedom. He didn't smile or agree. Instead, he got remarkably quiet and gave me this piercing, almost clinical look. He told me that most people who think they are free thinkers are actually just high-performing puppets reacting to systems they didn't design.
High-performing puppets, that's a heavy phrase.
And he wasn't being arrogant or cruel about it. He was just speaking with this detached clarity of someone who sees the invisible threads connecting every decision we make. That conversation it left me stunned. It made me realize that while we're all focused on the money, the truly wealthy are playing a completely different set of psychological games. Games where they don't just choose the moves, they choose the board itself. Most people spend their entire lives trying to win, never realizing that the game was rigged in favor of the house before they even sat down. To understand how they stay on top, you have to stop looking at their bank accounts and start looking at the psychological architecture they use to frame reality. That concept, this idea that the real game isn't financial but psychological, and that the truly powerful are focused on designing the system, not just playing within it. That's the core mission of this deep dive. We're going to unpack the science behind that whisper, really explore the specific psychological mechanisms that enable this kind of sustained generational dominance. We've broken this psychological architecture down into 3 critical areas, and each one is backed by some pretty powerful evolutionary and cognitive research. First, we're going to tackle the game of time, the fundamental difference in time horizons that stable wealth creates. Second, we'll dive into the game of focus, how the elite strategically preserve their executive function and their mental clarity. And finally, the game of narrative, the power they wield to continuously define the criteria for success itself, ensuring they always stay one step ahead of the chase.
And to really move beyond that incredible anecdote and understand these invisible threads of control, we need some precise scientific tools. So today we'll be using 3 main frameworks: evolutionary life history theory to analyze time and urgency, then cognitive niche construction to dissect focus and system design, and finally costly signaling theory to understand how they manipulate the narrative of what we even consider prestige. The goal here is, I think, transformative, to show you that the vast majority of human behaviors often dismissed as personal failures, things like impulsivity or short-sightedness or even chronic distraction, are actually highly adaptive, biologically rational responses to the external systems of scarcity and stress that most people are forced to navigate. By understanding the system, you finally start to understand the player.
That framing is so crucial. We're not discussing moral failings here. We're talking about biological adaptations to manufactured environments. So let's start with the most foundational element that wealth controls: time. Our first concept really highlights the profound difference time horizons make by contrasting 2 very different lives in the same city. I heard this story once about 2 men living in the same bustling district of London, and they're separated only by the thickness of a high-rise window and this vastness of their time horizons. One man, a 5th-generation landowner, spends his mornings in a quiet library, mapping out a 30-year plan for a reforestation project on his estate.
30 years.
30 years. To him, time is this lush, stable field where resources compound like slow-growing oaks. His environment is so predictable that his brain has evolved what we're going to call the slow life strategy. He doesn't need to hunt today because his tomorrow is already guaranteed. Meanwhile, 30 floors below, a delivery courier is weaving through lethal traffic, his mind just vibrating with the frantic ping of an algorithm.
Right, the immediate.
Exactly. For him, a 30-year plan is a fantasy. He is governed by adaptive impulsivity. His environment is just a series of immediate crises, a flat tire, a missed window, a late rent payment. His biology demands he prioritize the now, because in his world, the later is never promised. And it's just heartbreaking to realize that patience is often just a byproduct of a padded bank account, while the recklessness we see in struggling communities is actually a high-speed survival mechanism triggered by a world that offers no safety net.
That narrative, which draws such a sharp contrast between long-term security and that short-term crisis, it aligns perfectly with something called life history theory, or LHT. LHP is this sweeping evolutionary framework, and it's not just in human psychology, but across the entire biological world. It addresses how organisms optimally allocate finite resources over their lifespan.
Okay, so finite resources. How does that allocation actually break down?
Well, the primary split is between what's called somatic effort and reproductive effort. Somatic effort is all about survival and maintenance investing in your body, your health, your growth, your long-term future. Reproductive effort is more about, well, immediately passing on your genes. So LHT proposes this spectrum, a kind of slow, fast continuum, and it's based entirely on the stability and predictability of the external environment. We call these life history contingencies, or LHCs.
So the environment itself dictates the strategy.
Precisely. When an environment is stable, predictable, and supportive, what we'd call low harshness and low unpredictability, like the guaranteed generational wealth of that landowner, the optimal strategy is the slow life strategy.
SLHS.
Right, SLHS. If you know you're likely going to live a long, healthy life, it literally pays to wait. You prioritize delayed gratification, you invest heavily in education and health maintenance, and you engage in low-risk behaviors because the long-term compounding return on that patience is immense.
Yeah.
Your entire psychological framework is basically geared toward the distant future.
And the courier then operating on the street, he represents the absolute opposite end of that spectrum.
Exactly. That is the fast life strategy, or FLHS. This strategy is an adaptation to harsh, unpredictable environments, places characterized by high mortality rates where resources are uncertain and threats are common. In that world, natural selection favors a quick return on investment.
Get it while you can?
Get it while you can. The organism accelerates maturation, it maximizes immediate benefits, it prioritizes short-term gains, and critically, it exhibits a steep future discounting rate. If the chance of survival to age 50 is low, investing heavily in something that pays off at age 45 is, from a biological standpoint, irrational.
So the only rational choice is to maximize the now.
It is.
So when we see behaviors that are often judged in modern society, short-sighted financial decisions or lack of long-term planning, we're actually looking at a perfectly rational biological strategy. It's just one that's adapted to an environment that society has failed to stabilize.
That is the key realization that LHT provides. It's a huge paradigm shift. Many contemporary psychological models, they treat a preference for the here and now as a failure of self-control or a marker of dysfunction. LHT reframes it as an adaptive choice. This present orientation would have historically maximized fitness in ancestral environments marked by instability, even if it introduces significant health or social risks in modern civic life. The biological mechanism is designed to maximize reproductive success under duress, not necessarily long-term modern well-being.
And do we have strong evidence that links these harsh environments directly to this fast strategy, even in, contemporary populations?
We do, and it's quite compelling because it demonstrates that the environment is the trigger, regardless of anyone's intent. For example, studies looking at the life history of violent offenders often find that they act with profound impulsivity. Now, this behavior, while it increases their risk of physical injury and early mortality, it often correlates, in the short term, with behaviors that increase mating opportunities, more sexual partners, earlier reproduction. It's a very high-stakes, high-risk strategy that maximizes immediate potential, operating under the implicit biological assumption that life expectancy is short.
So biology is making a bet.
It's making a bet. And beyond that extreme, we see consistent patterns in how stress dictates time preferences. There was research on American university women that showed those who recalled greater early life stress, a high harshness cue, were measurably more present-oriented and reported an earlier age of sexual debut. We also see that adults living in neighborhoods marked by greater deprivation and volatility show a corresponding increase in behavioral disinhibition. The external chaos is internalized as a psychological urgency.
When you read quotes from people who are stuck in that FLHS mindset, it just brings the whole theory to life. I remember one quote from an individual who perfectly articulated this steep future discounting rate. He said, "I say fuck tomorrow. It's all about today. Might not be tomorrow. Might get shot, might get hit by a bus. So get it now, now. Next week, might as well be next century. F next week, F tomorrow.
And that is the psychological result of a persistent environmental threat. And here is where the wealthy play the ultimate game. They don't just adopt the slow strategy, they engineer their entire existence to create the life history contingencies that biologically necessitate the slow strategy.
So the stability itself is the mechanism of control. It's not just a nice side effect of being rich.
Precisely. They construct a low harshness, low unpredictability environment. This goes way beyond just having money. It's the certainty of having money, the safety nets, the political influence, the protection from external shocks. By removing unexpected threats and resource scarcity, they eliminate the cues that trigger the FLHS. This controlled environment, it biologically enables the psychological infrastructure needed for high-level long-term success. We're talking compound interest over decades, generational wealth transfers, planning 30 years out, or pursuing highly complex, slow-to-pay-off ventures.
The greatest luxury of wealth, then, is the psychological safety to ignore the present and focus only on what compounds.
You've got it.
It sounds like the system designers understand LHT instinctively. They enforce stability on their own circumstances while maybe unintentionally allowing instability to persist for everyone else, which keeps the knights on the chessboard trapped in reactive short-term game.
That's absolutely right. And this leads us to a really fascinating complexity within LHT when we talk about competition. We might assume that when resources are scarce and competition is high conditions found in dense urban centers or competitive modern economies, that it would encourage the SLHS mindset. The classic argument is, if it's hard to get resources, you should double down on discipline, investment, and long-term skill acquisition to compete effectively.
There would be the virtuous narrative society often preaches, right? Hustle harder, save more, invest in yourself. The bootstrap argument.
That was the traditional prediction. However, the data throws a bit of a curveball here, particularly concerning the type of competition. Researchers studied environments of high population density, scarcity, and competition situations that just scream resource problem. And they communicated these slow cues to participants, essentially reminding them that the long-term competition for resources was intensifying.
And what was the unexpected result?
Well, instead of participants becoming more disciplined, more forward-thinking, and planning long-term, the cues surprisingly increased the temptation to engage in exploitative behavior among younger individuals.
Wait, what?
In other words, communicating pervasive scarcity did not promote cooperation or increase somatic investment. It promoted cheating and immediate acquisition.
So telling people that resources are becoming scarce actually made them more likely to cheat or exploit others, not more cooperative or disciplined.
Yes.
That fundamentally undermines the whole idea that scarcity breeds discipline.
It does. It points to a crucial distinction between two forms of competition. The slow life strategy is promoted by what's called contest competition, where individuals compete by acquiring superior adaptations, like new skills, better education, or unique innovations. This rewards long-term investment.
The slow and steady wins the race.
But the data suggests that scarcity, especially when population density is high, often triggers a scramble competition mindset.
Okay, and what defines scramble competition?
Yeah. In a scramble competition, resources are quickly depleted and individuals have equal access, but the pool is shrinking fast. Think of Black Friday shoppers rushing for a limited number of discounted TVs.
I see.
If you know the resource is disappearing quickly, the rational adaptive behavior is to scramble and acquire it now before others beat you to it. It triggers immediate exploitation.
This mechanism is incredibly insidious. It means the system itself, by communicating pervasive resource scarcity in housing markets, job opportunities, healthcare access, actually triggers the exact kind of short-term exploitative behavior that undermines the individual's long-term stability. The game is psychologically rigged to promote self-sabotage by accelerating the perceived need to win right now.
It reinforces the core argument. Environmental pressures override personal willpower. The instability of the environment forces a reactive, fast strategy, irrespective of whether the slow strategy is preached as the morally virtuous or successful path. And if controlling your external environment to master time is the first step of the system designers, then the next must be mastering the scarce resource inside their own head attention. Which brings us seamlessly to the shocking contrast of cognitive load.
The insight that time mastery is achieved by controlling the external environment leads us directly to how the truly powerful preserve their most valuable, non-renewable resource, their focus, or their executive function. We're moving from the evolutionary game of long-term survival to the cognitive game of high-level performance. I saw this fascinating profile online about a tech founder in San Francisco. He has essentially outsourced his humanity to preserve his executive function.
Outsourced his humanity. I like that.
Right. He doesn't choose his clothes, they're delivered in identical sets. He doesn't choose his meals. A nutritionist programmed system ensures the right caloric intake hits his desk at exactly 12:40 p.m. He has built a cognitive niche where every low-level decision, all the noise of life, is offloaded to an external system. And this allows his brain to remain a pristine, high-stakes navigation tool, focused entirely on strategic moves that shift markets. Now, contrast this with a single mother I read about in the same city. She spends 4 hours a day calculating the marginal utility of coupons, navigating complex bus schedules, and managing the emotional fallout of a broken radiator.
The cognitive load there is immense.
It's crushing. Her executive function is perpetually exhausted by 1,000 micro-decisions that the wealthy man hasn't made in a decade. It feels deeply unsettling to realize that the reactive behavior we criticize in the working class is often just decision fatigue. When your brain is taxed by the sheer cost of living, you don't have the mental RAM left to design a system to escape. It's a cognitive trap where the most tired people are forced to make the hardest choices.
This is a perfect illustration of the game of focus, and it's rooted in the cognitive science of cognitive offloading and cognitive niche construction. Let's first define offloading, because it's much more sophisticated than just making a list.
Okay, let's unpack this. If it's more than just a to-do list, what is the technical definition of cognitive offloading?
Cognitive offloading is the deliberate action of relying on external manipulations or artifacts, anything from a knot on a string to a highly structured checklist to an automated scheduling system, specifically to reduce the internal cognitive demands placed on our limited mental hardware.
Our limited hardware.
Yes. Humans have intrinsic biological limits on memory storage, attention span, and high-level processing. We have evolved and designed tools to bypass these limits, allowing us to achieve things that our raw biological memory could never manage.
So the value is not in the external artifact itself, the identical clothes or the preset meal, but in the mental energy saved by not having to spend limited mental resources on those decisions.
Exactly. And the tech founder isn't just offloading. He's engaging in what we call cognitive niche construction. He is building an external environment, his entire lifestyle, specifically engineered to preserve his limited executive function.
Executive function, that's the key term here.
It is. Executive function is the set of high-level cognitive processes necessary for goal-directed behavior. Strategic navigation, complex planning, working memory management, and the inhibition of dominant reactive responses. This is the mental horsepower required to shift a market, design a complex strategy, or invent a new industry.
In essence, he is using his wealth not just to buy things, but to buy mental quiet.
Precisely. We see the clear value of this offloading in high-stakes professions. Consider surgeons or pilots. They rely on detailed, systematic checklists, not because they're incompetent, but because their job involves incredibly high cognitive demands and absolutely no room for error.
Right, it's not a crutch, it's a tool.
It's a professional tool. By outsourcing the low-level routine steps to a physical checklist, they avoid cognitive overload and decision fatigue. This frees up their mental bandwidth for the hardest, most creative, and most critical judgments. There are famous studies showing that using simple surgical checklists dramatically cuts complications, demonstrating that reducing mental friction can be a matter of life and death, or in the founder's case, market dominance.
So if that founder is constructing this pristine environment to keep his executive function clear, what is happening to the single mother whose life is just characterized by constant low-level friction?
She is experiencing acute cognitive exhaustion and decision fatigue. Every single small choice under conditions of scarcity carries immense weight. Does she spend money on the bus or save it for food? Which coupon yields the best marginal utility? How does she manage the emotional fallout of a sudden mechanical failure? Each of those micro-decisions drains the limited pool of executive function.
The tank just runs empty.
It does. The research is very clear. Scarcity itself consumes cognitive capacity. When you are constantly stressed about resources, that stress occupies a significant portion of your working memory. And working memory is the small mental scratch pad we use to hold and manipulate information for complex problem solving. If that scratch pad is constantly filled with, I need to pay rent, or do I have enough gas, there is simply no mental RAM left to engage in strategic thinking, long-term planning, or, most importantly, system design.
So the high-performing puppet we discussed in the opening isn't a puppet because they lack intelligence. They're a puppet because they are constantly operating at 95% cognitive capacity just to manage the friction of existence. That leaves them incapable of seeing the board, let alone moving the pieces strategically.
That's the cognitive trap. The people who most need systems of support to offload that cognitive friction are the ones least able to afford or build them, because their mental resources are consumed by the sheer grinding cost of survival.
This brings up an intriguing subtlety, though. It's not just if you offload, but how well you manage the offloading process. Is there a marker of superior intelligence in this domain?
Absolutely. The highest form of intelligence in this domain is selectivity, which is underpinned by metacognition.
Metacognition.
Thinking about thinking.
Thinking about thinking, exactly. It's the ability to reflect on and understand your own internal cognitive limits, knowing when your brain is about to fail or when it's being inefficient. Smart system designers don't just offload indiscriminately, they engage in this metacognitive reflection to weigh the effort of the offloading action against the reduction in mental demand. For instance, if it takes more effort to write down a note than it does to simply remember it, they won't write it down. But if the mental task is complex or involves multiple steps, they offload immediately and systematically.
So there's a skill to it. Can we actually see this skill develop? Yes, and the developmental parallels are quite telling. Studies tracking children's ability to selectively offload show that this skill increases linearly throughout childhood. For instance, when given a task involving visual memory, younger children might use an external aid, like manually rotating a visual menu, even when the stimulus is easy to mentally rotate.
They use the tool even when they don't need it.
Right. But older children, however, they become significantly more selective. They only use the external rotation when the internal cognitive demand is high, demonstrating a calibrated metacognitive awareness of when offloading is actually beneficial. They know when the offload effort is redundant.
This implies that the strategic difference between the wealthy system designer and the busy entrepreneur isn't just about financial resources, but about a calibrated intelligence applied to life itself. The founder has designed his entire life architecture to ensure his superior cognitive horsepower is reserved for market-shifting moves, while the puppet is forced to burn that power just managing the daily friction.
Strategic clarity is born when mental friction is systematically removed. The wealthy are using system design as a profound psychological preservation mechanism, ensuring they always have the mental space required to operate on the highest strategic level.
So if they control time by engineering stability, and they control focus by engineering systems, then the final, most elusive piece of the puzzle is controlling the very meaning of success itself. And that takes us into the game of narrative, the power to continuously define what winning even looks like. This final game is perhaps the most ruthless psychologically, because it ensures non-elites are always chasing a ghost, a moving target for perceived value. Try to imagine a closed-door gallery opening in Manhattan where the definition of status is being rewritten in real time. I read about this phenomenon where the truly dominant class suddenly abandoned flashy logos, the very things the middle class had finally saved up to buy, and pivoted to quiet luxury and niche sustainability.
The goalposts moved.
Instantly. This is signaling theory in its purest, most ruthless form. By changing the prestige criteria, the elite ensure that as soon as the general population mimics their behavior, that behavior loses its social value. They control the narrative framework, ensuring that those outside the circle are always chasing a ghost.
This phenomenon is perfectly explained by costly signaling theory, or CST. It's an evolutionary concept that governs how organisms, including humans, broadcast reliable information about their quality. Whether you are signaling health, resources, or ability, the fundamental rule of CST is that the signal must be costly difficult or too expensive for those lacking the underlying quality to fake.
Right, so if I buy a cheap knockoff of a luxury watch, the signal is unreliable because the cost barrier has been breached. And if the middle class starts buying the entry-level designer brand, that brand ceases to be a reliable signal of elite status.
Exactly. The moment the signal becomes affordable or accessible to the masses, it loses its costliness relative to the population you wish to differentiate yourself from. And this introduces a crucial sociological distinction between types of value. A commodity has a material use value, its functional utility, like a coat keeping you warm. But wealth is often accumulated for its sign value, the prestige and social status it imparts to the possessor. For the elite, the sign value almost always supersedes the use value. They're buying status, not utility.
So how do they actively manage this narrative? It sounds like you need a playbook.
Well, to understand the playbook, we can turn back to Thorstein Veblen, who analyzed this mechanism over a century ago in the theory of the leisure class. Veblen observed that in stratified societies, the upper class, which he termed the leisure class, maintains its position not just through wealth, but by conspicuously demonstrating its exemption from economically productive work.
So Veblen realized that simply accumulating wealth wasn't enough. You had to prove your detachment from the necessity of labor. You had to show you didn't need to work.
That's right. And this external demonstration drives what he called pecuniary emulation.
Pecuniary emulation. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, it's basically the chase. It's the economic effort by the lower classes to imitate or try to surpass the status signals of the rich. People engage in a pecuniary struggle to acquire and exhibit wealth because those items are perceived as belonging to a higher social class. This is why people buy goods purely for their sign value, even if they have to incur debt or sacrifice utility.
And it perfectly explains the old strategy. Conspicuous consumption. Lavish spending oversized mansions, custom clothes, private jets. It was all designed to visibly display resources and pecuniary superiority in a way that others couldn't possibly afford. It was a reliable signal.
And it was adaptive. Evolutionary psychologists have shown that this display works. There were experiments that demonstrated that males pictured with luxury cars or high-status clothing were perceived by females as more desirable mates.
Because it signaled higher resource control and investment potential.
Exactly. It worked as an honest, costly signal.
But the moment mass production and global wealth creation allowed the aspiring class to start participating in that consumption, the elite instantly changed the rules. That's the pivot to quiet luxury and effortless curation you mentioned.
It is the strategic, relentless redefinition of the prestige criteria. The elite control power by defining the system's inputs, by dictating what counts as valuable and virtuous, by moving to quiet luxury clothing with no visible logos, subtle craftsmanship only recognizable by insiders. They instantly devalue the flashy consumption the middle class struggled to achieve. They move the cost barrier from simple expense to cultural capital. You can't fake knowledge of obscure Chilean tailoring houses or subtle specific tastes quickly.
They're essentially demanding a higher admission price to the club, not just in dollars, but in accumulated knowledge and, crucially, time.
Precisely. And this leads to the most important signal, which is less about what they buy and more about what they are demonstrably exempt from doing. Conspicuous leisure. This is the non-productive consumption of time, a primary signal of high status. If you are visibly exempt from useful employment, you can spend your time on non-productive pursuits, which signals your total financial freedom.
So what are some modern forms of conspicuous leisure that Veblen observed? How does that show up today?
Veblen provided some clear examples that are still relevant. One is the pursuit of high-level education in abstract subjects like philosophy, classics, or pure mathematics. These are preferred over practical, job-oriented schooling like engineering or manufacturing, which are seen as low status because they lead directly to productive labor.
So abstract knowledge signals that you don't need a job. You're just consuming knowledge purely for its intellectual sign value.
Exactly. Another example is the adoption of archaic social skills, such as detailed manners, complicated etiquette, or proficiency in obscure historical knowledge. These are skills that require massive amounts of non-productive time to acquire and maintain. They signal that the person has the leisure to consume time in ways that yield zero economic productivity.
And Veblen also noted that even the people surrounding the elite become signals. You mentioned this concept of vicarious leisure.
Yes, that is a powerful mechanism of control. Veblen observed that the women and servants of the leisure class function as objects of vicarious leisure. The moral incapacity of a wife to engage in productive labor, the idea that she shouldn't have a job, powerfully communicates the husband's high social standing and his complete exemption from toil.
So her lack of a job is the signal.
It is. The woman's activity, or more often her deliberate lack of activity and her focus on non-productive, display-oriented tasks like hosting elaborate parties or maintaining a complex social calendar, becomes the clearest indicator of the man's socioeconomic success.
So whether they are opting for the expensive, logoless cashmere sweater or engaging in a centuries-old code of conduct, the system designers are always broadcasting signals that are too costly for non-elites to fake consistently. They're constantly moving the cultural goalposts.
They control the narrative framework, ensuring that the vast majority remains focused on chasing the last iteration of success, buying the items that are just about to be psychologically devalued, leaving the designers free to define the next one. We even see this strategic duality in how they manage public perception. Something like public philanthropy is a form of costly signal designed to attract new cooperators and garner public goodwill. It's blatant benevolence, signaling wealth and influence.
That makes perfect sense. It's an external signal aimed at the wider population.
But here's the fascinating twist. Those already established within the system, the existing elite cooperators, often view these public displays with deep suspicion and skepticism. They recognize the philanthropic signal as a strategic move meant to gain recognition or political prestige, rather than pure, sincere cooperative intent.
So it's a game within a game.
It is. It highlights that the most powerful are skeptical even of their own signals, which further reinforces their detachment and strategic clarity. The signal is designed for you, the outsider, but not necessarily for those inside the club.
The game of narrative is the game of defining reality, ensuring they maintain psychological distance and control by shifting the framework of what virtue, success, and even effort truly mean. This deep dive has fundamentally recast the pursuit of wealth, shifting our focus from simple financial accumulation to the sophisticated psychological architecture of dominance. We've seen how the truly powerful secure their position by mastering three distinct psychological games. First, the game of time, where they achieve long-term strategic success by creating an environment of profound stability, enabling that slow life strategy. Second, the game of focus, where they preserve their limited executive function by systematically offloading mental friction through cognitive niche construction. And third, the game of narrative, where they maintain distance and prestige by continuously controlling and moving the goalposts of success through costly signaling and defining the criteria of virtue.
The essential synthesis here is this. To understand the system designers, you have to stop looking at their bank statements or their purchases. Instead, you have to analyze the psychological safety nets and strategic offloading systems they employ. The evolutionary and cognitive forces at play are, in a way, designed to keep most people psychologically busy, fighting inside a resource-scarce box. The high-performing puppet is perpetually trapped in reactive short-term strategies because their entire cognitive architecture is consumed by the friction of existence.
So they aren't just richer, they are psychologically freer. The ultimate advantage isn't the accumulation of money itself.
The truly powerful don't just accumulate money, they accumulate optionality and cognitive space. This psychological capital enables the long-term, low-friction strategies that ensure sustained dominance, providing the strategic clarity that others, burdened by the noise and urgency of daily friction, can never achieve.